All right, well, so let's begin top of Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. So says the Gemara, B'socha kan, u'matzlif ne'ak kan asurin. So remember again, the Mishnah spoke about the case where if you went ahead and on Erev Yom Tov, you designated the chicks inside the dovecote, and then you found them outside of the dovecote, or I should say more appropriately, in front of the dovecote, that the doves are asur. So the Gemara says, Lema Mesayele, Rabbi Chanina. Let's say that this idea supports Rabbi Chanina. What does Rabbi Chanina say? Dam Rabbi Chanina, Rov v'karov halach achar harov. Because Rabbi Chanina says that when you have two conflicting chazakos, one established by rov, by majority, Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, 3 lines down, or the other established by karov, proximity, that rov wins out. So both sides, because remember again, what the Mishnah is saying over here is that Lamaisa, if you designated the doves inside the dovecote, and then you come on Yontiv and you find them in front of the dovecote. So apparently, when the Mishnah says that it's also what the Mishnah says is because we assume that the doves in front of the dovecote are not the same ones as the doves that were inside the dovecote. So therefore, you see from here that despite the fact that the doves inside the dovecote are closer to the front of the dovecote, nevertheless, we go after the majority of doves that are not from the dovecote. So the Gemara says, you see from here that when you have a conflict between the realities created between rov and karov, you go after rov. Amar Abaye says, no, not necessarily. Bidaf. What are we dealing with over here? We're dealing with over here a platform. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Bidaf, Dikulhu karov ninu, Hilchach halach achar harov diikatarti. So I'll say, here's the difference. This daf, this platform that there is in front of this dovecote, so apparently certain dovecotes had a larger platform that was used as a resting place for doves from all over, not just doves from that particular dovecote. Therefore, lemaisa, because of that, it's like a gathering place. Therefore, because of that, it's considered to be karov for all of the birds, and therefore lemaisa we go ahead and we call this, it has rov and karov. Rava says Bishnei kanin zu lemala mizu askinan. Rava on the other hand says we're dealing with two different dovecotes, one on top of the other. Velomi boy. So the Gemara says Velomi boy zim betachtona velo zim be'elyona. And the Gemara says it goes without saying that if you designated the birds in the bottom one and did not designate the birds in the upper one, so I'll say, so just keep this in mind. So now I'm going on Erev Yom Tov, I'm designating the bottom dovecote. I did not do anything with the upper dovecote. Umatza betachtona velo matza be'elyona. And what happens? I come on Yom Tov and I find birds in the lower one, which Rabbosai would seem to be good because those are the birds that I designated, but I didn't find any birds in the upper one. The asiran, the halacha is that the bottom ones are asur. Why? The aminan hanach azlu la'alma, v'hanach ishtarvu ve'ishtarvu v'nochus. Because Rabbosai, the fact that there are no birds in the upper one leads me to fear that what happened? Perhaps again the ones in the bottom one left, and Lamaisa, the birds that are there now are the birds that came down from the upper dovecote. Ella afilu zimin be'elyona v'lo zim betachtona. But rather, even if you went ahead and you designated the birds in the upper dovecote and you did not designate the birds in the lower dovecote, and I come on Yontav and I find birds in the upper one, but do not find birds in the lower one. That's what? Hanach nami asiri. That Rabbi said the ones in the upper one are also asir. Why? Da'aminan hanach azlu la'alma, v'hanach seruchi sarich usaliko. Because Rabbi said, what am I concerned about? I'm concerned that maybe the ones in the upper one fled as well. And then what happened? The ones in the lower one, literally it means climbed up to the upper dovecote. So also what the Gemara seems to be saying over here is that any time that you have some kind of disruption between the setup that there was between the status quo that was established in Erev Yom Tov, one is choshesh for not just a change in one particular area, but one is choshesh ultimately again for a change in all of the circumstances. Okay. V'im sham elahein hare elu mutarin. So also what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah said, V'im ein sham elahim, the case of the Mishnah was, Besocha kan umatz lifnei akan, if you designated birds inside the dovecote, and then you find them on Yom Tov outside of the dovecote, asurin, they're asur. However, again, V'im ein sham elahim hare elu mutarim, but if there are no other doves, so then the ones that are, so again, on Erev Yom Tov, you designated doves inside the dovecote, then you went ahead and you find them outside of the dovecote. So the Mishnah says it's asur, unless, of course, these are the only doves If they're the only doves, then it's mutter. So the Gemara says, Hechi dami. What's the case of only doves? What does that mean? If you want to say we're talking about doves that have the ability to fly, then both say again, you could very easily say what? That the birds that you designated on Erev Yom Tov are gone, and these are new ones that have come instead because they have the ability for flight. So the Gemara says, Ella b'midadidin. So Rabbi say again, rather it must be what? We're talking about midadidin, Rabbi say literally means hop. But hop in this context means more than just simply hop. Hop in this context means more than just simply hop. Hop really means flight for short distances. Flight for short distances. So the Gemara says, "Idi ika kan besoch barbekain besoch shloshim besoch hamishim ama." If there's another nest within 50 amos, adude adudu. Then Rabbi say adadu. Then what? So Rabbi say again. Apparently, a young dove will hop or will fly for short bursts for another destination within 50 amos. V'i daleka kan besoch hamishim ama. And the Maisa again, so we'll say again, if there is another dovecote within 50 amos, so then you'd have to be concerned that even birds that are not yet fully flight ready are still hopping from one dovecote to the other. In which case, again, remember, as nice as that sounds, the doves are flying. But again, for your Yom Tov purposes, it throws a wrench in your meal plans because the mice, again, once they're flying and there's another dovecote within 50 amos, there's the possibility that the doves that you find on Yom Tov are not the doves that you designate on Erev Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, rather it has to be and if there's no other dovecote within 50 amos, meaning that's of the dovecote from which you designated doves on Erev Yom Tov, then pshita dimutarin. Then Rabbi say again, then as Avi said, it's not mutter. So the Gemara is trying to figure out what exactly is the case where the Mishnah says that if there are no other doves, then even though you designated the doves inside and now you're finding them outside, that they're mutter. So what's the case? If doves take flight, then everything's going to be aser. If the doves don't take flight, then Lamais, again, it depends on where the next closest dovecote is. If it's within 50 amos, then you have to be choshesh for medida, that the dove hops over there. If it's further than 50 amos, you don't have to worry about the dove hopping over there. What's the pshat? So this is actually very, very interesting. Kala medade excuse me, I should have. I'm a pshita de mutar and Amar Ukva bar chama kala medade ein medade yosem chamishim. And again, if there is no other dovecote within 50 amos, then it's obvious that even though you designated the doves on the inside and now you find them on the outside, that those are the same doves. Why? Because again, Lamai said there's no other place for doves to have come from. To which the Gemara said, in reality, what's the case of the Mishnah? The case of the Mishnah is where there is another dovecote, and that other dovecote is within 50 amos. So if that's the case, so then why is it Reposted? If I designate doves inside the dovecote on Erev Yom Tov, and I find them outside the dovecote on Yom Tov itself, that the doves are mutter, they should be usher if there's another dovecote within 50 amos. Ukigon dighaima b'karen zovis. Rabbi say, where is the other dovecote? The other dovecote is around the corner. Rabbi say, you should have a diagram in Rashi. Right? You see that? I always find it interesting. This, out of all the things that the Gemara discusses, this is actually not difficult to conceptualize. There are so many things that we would appreciate the diagram from Rashi, but for some reason, I don't know, maybe this is low-lying fruit. In any event, so what he says over here, around the corner literally means around the corner. I will say, what's the chap? The chap is that the two dovecotes are within 50 amos of one another, but what? Are not visible one from the other. So what does that matter? Rabbi said, this is amazing. Kamash Malon, kol hecha de madada, v'hader chazi lekaneha, midada, v'ilo lo midada. Rabbi said, it's actually a very profound yesod, that when does the young dove go ahead and fly to another dovecote, he'll only go to another dovecote, even to the 50 amos, as long as what? He can look back and see his dovecote. It's a very profound Gemara. He'll only go ahead. He'll only go somewhere if he can look back and see home. If he can't look back and see home, he's not going to go. So the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even though you have over here another dovecote within 50 amos, which technically speaking is the proximity in which again a young dove who's not flight ready could go from one dovecote to the other dovecote, since it's around the corner, so there's no visibility. Therefore, Lamaisa, we assume that doves do not travel back and forth. Therefore, halacha Lamaisa, on Erev Yom Tov, you designate the doves inside the dovecote, and on Yom Tov you come and the doves are outside of the dovecote. Those doves are still permitted because we assume that those are the same ones that you that you designated on Erev Yom Tov. Okay. I'm sorry. No. These are your doves.
But then how, if they're showing up, we're talking about a designation issue, but what about an ownership issue?
So there must have been, I guess, a certain understanding that what's in your dovecote is your. I think. Says the Mishnah, Beishame Omrim. We'll say again another interesting case. Ein notlin es ha'oli lekatse valav es habasar. So we'll say oli literally is, or eli is literally a pestle. So we'll say Rashi points out over here. Ali, or Eli, I should say, melachto leiser lichtosh b'machteshes mishum hachi asri la beishamai. So we'll say, but this is not just like a simple little mortar and pestle. This is a larger pestle that was used to grind wheat. So this essentially was a slab. This was a large stone slab that was used to crush wheat. So the Gemara says, I want to use this slab on Yom Tov because I want to cut meat on it. So obviously I can't grind wheat on Yom Tov, but I would like to go ahead and, I can't grind wheat on Yom Tov, even though, again, tochen grinding could actually be done for ochel nafesh, but large-scale tochen, like the grinding of wheat, cannot be done on Yom Tov. So the Mishnah says over here, so Beis Shammai says, you cannot go ahead and take the ali to go ahead and cut meat on it, Beis Hillel matirin, but Beis Hillel permits it. Next, Beis Shammai omrim ein nosnin es ha'or lifnei adarsan. We saw this in yesterday's daf. So Beis Hillel says, you may not go ahead and take a hide of meat and literally put it in front of people to be trampled. Now I will say, you saw this yesterday, that halacha l'maisa, part of the tanning of a hide is that you wanted people to walk all over it. So Beis Shammai says that you may not go ahead and do that on Yom Tov, because that's equivalent to tanning a hide, and l'maisa that's also v'lo yagbi'ena ela imkin yishmo kizayis basar. Furthermore, Beis Shammai says you may not even lift up the hide unless, of course, there is at least a kizayis of meat on the hide. Otherwise, according to Beis Shammai, the hide itself is considered to be muktzah. Beis Hillel matirin. Beis Hillel permits. I will say Beis Hillel seemingly permits both of these things. A, putting the hide down in a place where it's going to get trampled. That's number one. And B, lifting it up even if it doesn't have a kizayis of meat on it. So says the Gemara. So we'll say, let's analyze these cases. V'shavin shim katsav alav basar sha'asla tatlo. But say Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree. Now Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree in terms of the use of the ali on Yom Tov. Beis Shammai says it's aser, and apparently what Beis Shammai is really saying is because l'maisa it's muktzah. That's what Beis Shammai seems to be saying, it's muktzah. Beis Hillel is saying that you're permitted to go ahead and use it for permissible use, like cutting meat on it. But now the Gemara says both agree that if you did use it, that you can't move it after its use. Meaning that even Beis Hillel's license to use the object is only what? To move it for the sake of a tzorech Yom Tov. But l'maisa, at the end of the day, once you've used it, you've used up that license already. You may not go ahead and move it back to its original location. Rashi says, first white line in Rashi, Sh'asla tatlo, di is avid leit tzorech Yom Tov. Because once you've cut the meat, the Yom Tov purpose has been served. Once the Yom Tov purpose has been served, that's it. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, machlokes ba'ali. Abaye says the machlokes is only when it comes to this pestle, this large pestle. Ava betavra garmi divrei hakol mutar. But also when it comes to a butcher's cutting board, everyone agrees that it's mutar. And we'll say, what does that mean that it's mutar? That l'maisa, that you can go ahead and move a butcher's cutting board to cut meat on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, that's obvious. Pshita. Of course you can move a butcher's cutting board first. So Ali Tanan. The Mishnah only brings up a discussion regarding, again, the Ali, the pestle, which indicates that what? That the cutting board, of course, is mutter. So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? Huadin da'afidu tavra. Huadin da'afidu tavra garmi nami. I might have thought that maybe there's an issue even with going ahead and moving the butcher's cutting board. So we'll say, take a look at Rashi. Now, what's the havamina that there would have been a problem with the butcher's cutting board? Look at Rashi. Ma'adatema. Huadin da'afilu tavra garmi asri Beis Shammai dilma basar detaltala mamlich Velo tavar v'ishtakach detarech bichdi. So we'll say it's very interesting. What the Gemara is suggesting over here is that I might have thought that maybe you can't even move the butcher's cutting board. Why? Because Rabbi say, what's the issue? Beis Shammai would have a concern that after you move it, you may go ahead and change your mind. You may decide that, you know what, I'm not shechting. And therefore, what would happen? What happened is you end up engaging in unnecessary exertion. So I might have thought that even the butcher's cutting board should be usher to go ahead and move. So the Gemara says, and the only reason why the Mishnah mentioned the case of the pestle was to tell you the strength of Beis Hillel's position that they even permit the moving of the pestle. That Beis Hillel even permits you to move what we call in the laws of Muktzah a klisha malachta le'isr. Klisha malachta le'isr means a utensil that has a primarily prohibited use, but that has a secondary permitted use. So, for example, like this pestle, the primary use is for grinding wheat, which of course is asr, but the secondary permitted use is what? Is it can be used as a cutting board. Therefore, Kamash Malon, that's not the case. Kamash Malon, that even Beis Shammai would agree that you can go ahead and move the butcher's cutting board. Ikedamri, others have a different version of this. Amr Abaye lo nitzracha ela afilu tavragarmi chadati. So Abaye says, Rabbi say this is a different version. So Abaye says that the truth is the chiddush is to teach us that you could even go ahead and move a brand new cutting board, a brand new butcher's cutting board. What's the chiddush? Ma'udetema mamlich v'lo tavrala. So I might have thought that maybe again, because it's a brand new cutting board, he may have a change of heart and he may decide, you know what, I'm not going to use it as a cutting board. I'm going to use it as something else. I'm going to go ahead and decide to designate it for a different use. Kamash malan, that we are not choshesh for this. So I was like, so therefore, again, what comes out according to this Gemara so far is like this: Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel about whether or not one could use the oli. Beis Shammai says no. Beis Shammai says no, and apparently, again, part of Beis Shammai's logic seems to be, could be an issue of muktzah, could be an issue ultimately, again, of people having a change of heart, that after you do the exertion, a person might not go through with the process of shechita, and therefore it turns out that you've transported this item for no good reason. Whereas Beis Hillel says, l'tzarech yamtiv, you're permitted to go ahead and use it, but apparently, again, with the butcher's cutting board, certainly an old one, even though that might bring with it a chashash of tircha yisira, you might carry and not end up using it, and even a new one, where a person might decide, you know what, I'm not using it for this purpose at all. Even Beis Shammai would agree that lemaisa you can use it. So the Gemara says, Beis Shammai lo chayshi leim luchi. Are you telling me that Beis Shammai is not choshesh that people may change their mind? V'hatanya we learned Beis Shammai omrim ein molichin. This is very interesting. Ein molichin tavach v'sakin eitzel behema. You can't transport the butcher and the knife to the animal. V'lo behema eitzel tabach v'sakin. Nor may you transport the animal to the butcher and the knife. And I will say, what's the logic behind that? If you look at Rashi, he says, "In molichin tabach v'sakin, im hayuricholkin zemizeh." If let's say again the animal was far away, you can't transport the butcher to the animal or the animal to the butcher. Why? Dilma basar detarich mamlich, because Beis Shammai is choshesh. That's what Rabbi was saying. After you make the journey to the animal, what's going to happen? You're going to decide, you know what? I'd rather have milchiks. So Beis Shammai says that's a problem. Why? Because then it turns out that you've engaged in unnecessary exertion on Yom Tov. So you see from here that Beis Shammai is choshesh, that people change their mind. Beis Hillel says no. Molichin ze eitzel ze. And Beis Hillel says no. You can go ahead and you could take one to the other. So the Gemara goes weiter. Similarly, one may not transport spices and the pestle to a mortar. Velo meducha, not a mortar. Eitzel tavlin umaduch. Beis Hillel omrim molichin ze eitzel ze. And Beis Hillel says you can't. So you see two different cases over here, where Lemaisa, Beis Shammai seems to be concerned for one thing, which is that people change their mind. And because people change their mind, Beis Shammai says, now again, I want to be clear. Beis Shammai allows you to shecht, Beis Shammai allows you to grind, but he says what? It's got to be there. It's got to be there already. The animal has to be there. The spices have to be there. The utensils have to be there. If it requires transportation through large distances, that we're not going to let you do. Why? Because there's a concern that after you exert yourself, you may change your mind. Beis Hillel apparently is not choshesh for these things. So the Gemara says, Hochi hashta bishlama behema asil emluche. So we'll say, using that logic, we should say the same thing over here. that Beis Shammai would not agree to allow you to transport the butcher's cutting block, or allow the shochet to travel to the butcher's cutting block. Let's just deal with the case of transporting the block. Beis Shammai would not permit you to transport the block. Why? Because maybe once you transport it, you may have a change of heart. So the Gemara says, no, it's not comparable. Why? So the Gemara says, Bishlama behema asile imluche. When it comes to the case of the animal, I understand the havamina of why Beis Shammai does not want you going to the animal or transporting the animal to you. Why? Because it's possible asile imluche dara nishbak hay behema kachusha umaisina behema achrisi de shmeina mine. Because also when it comes to animals, it's understandable. A person shulchan could say, you know what? Instead of shechting this animal over here, this animal is a little bit on the skinny side. Let's leave this one and let's find a fatter animal. So the idea that you could be ready to go ahead and shecht, but at the same time then the next moment say, you know what, I'd rather shecht a different kind of animal. I hear that. You could have a change of heart. Similarly, Kedei Nami, when it comes to a cooked dish, remember Rabbi say, why are you grinding up spices on Yom Tov? You're grinding up spices to spice your food. So I understand why Beis Shammai is nervous about the change of heart by spices as well. Because a person could say, you know what, I was going to make this dish that requires spices. So Rashi says, what's an example of a dish that requires spices? Meat and onions. Sounds good, right? So I could go ahead and leave aside my meat and onions, and instead, umaisina achrisi, I'll make something else. Rashi says, what's an example of a dish that does not require spices? Rashi says turnips and cabbage. Doesn't require spices because who's going to eat it, right? So again, the Gemara says, "Nami asi leimluchi damanishbak haikader debayit tavlin umaisina achri still bayit tavlin." Hacha ma'ikalemema Rabosa. In the case of the butcher's cutting board, we're not choshesh for a change of heart. Why? Mimlach velo tavar. Could it be that the butcher is going to have a change of heart and not go ahead and cut up the meat? Kevan deshachta litvir kanavasa. Remember, you only bring the butcher's cutting board when? After shechita took place. Once shechita took place, he's not going to have a change of heart and say, you know what, we shouldn't cut up the meat. Once the animal is slaughtered, it's clear that, again, the cutting of the meat has to be done, and therefore even Beis Shammai would agree that there's no problem transporting the butcher's cutting board, because it's not choshish that someone's going to have a change of heart. Beis Shammai omrim ein nos nesar. So also remember, the next case in the Mishnah was the following. Came down to after you shecht in the animal, you have the hide. Part of the process of the hide has to be trampled upon. I will say, remember again, you can't wait too long to go ahead and do something with the hide. Otherwise, it stiffens. Once it stiffens, you can't really tan it anymore. So how do you? But yet again, you can't tan a hide on Yom Tov because at the end of the day, again, that is a malacha. So remember, Beis Hillel essentially allows you to just place it down in a place where people are going to be walking, not for the intention of tanning it, but just whatever. People are just traversing this, just pedestrian traffic. Beis Shammai prohibits this process. So the Gemara says, Tana. V'shavin shemolchan alav basar litzli. Also, what's interesting is both Beis Shammai still agree that what can you do? You can go ahead. Rabbi say you have to salt meat. There's a halacha that you're not allowed to eat blood. So obviously, when you shecht meat, there's a lot of blood absorbed in the meat itself. So you have to salt the meat in order to go ahead and draw the blood out of the meat. The difference is the following: if you are going to be roasting meat, meaning if you're going to be, like a barbecue, right? There's a better word than roasting. We'll call it roasting. Right? You're going to be cooking meat on a fire. So the halacha is it only needs a very light salting. Because since, again, the fire itself draws out the blood, you just need a minimal amount of salting. So the Gemara says like this. The Shavin, both Beis Shammai still agree. Shemolchan alav basar litzli. Say, what can you do on top of the hide? You can salt meat for the purpose of roasting it, which again is just a minimal amount of salting. I will say, what's the chiddush of this? Salting a hide is part of the tanning process. So the Gemara says, both Beis Shammai still agree that you could salt meat for roasting, which again is a minimal amount of salting on top of the hide. Even though what ends up happening, there's a shtickle tanning that takes place as a result of it. But since, again, that's not your intention is to simply go ahead and salt the meat for roasting purposes, that you're permitted to go ahead and do this. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, lo shana ela litzli, aval lekeder lo. Abaye qualifies this and he says, okay, but this is only if you're salting meat for the purpose of roasting it, not for the purpose of going ahead and cooking it. So once again, remember, there's a much more significant amount of salting that occurs for cooking it, what Abaye calls lekedera. which is non-roasting, then there would be that already would be too much salting. That would be already obvious that you're doing it for the sake of tanning the hide, and therefore that would be usher. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. Litzlitanan. Okay, Abai, thank you very much. The Beitzah already said that, right? We just said that before, that it only works if you're salting it for the purpose of roasting, not for the purpose of cooking. Ha kamashon da'afil litzli ke'ein kedera aser. So I'll say, what's the chiddush? The chiddush is, let's say a person says, you know what, I'm going to roast the meat, but I like to salt it a lot. So you can't say, meaning just because you say that you're salting it for the purpose of roasting it, does not what? Give you a license to put as much salt of it as you want. So what Abai is saying is, even if you're salting it for the purpose of roasting it, you can't put as much salt on it as you would for the purpose of cooking it. Tan Rabbanon. So once the Gemara spoke about salting, the Gemara brings up another couple of cases. Ein molchin esach chalavin. You can't go ahead and salt fats. So we'll say, remember, fats, chaylev, so you can have a couple of cases of this. If it's chaylev of a behema, so chaylev of a behema is aser. You can't eat it. But what can you do with it? It's mutter ba'ana. You can get benefit from it. So you can feed it to your animals. You can use it for fuel on a fire. You could sell it to a non-Jew. You can do whatever you want with it. If it's chaylev of a chaya, remember chaylev of a chaya ultimately is permitted for consumption. This is talking about chaylev of a behema. This is chaylev you can't eat. So we'll say if you can't eat it, so you can't salt it. Now, why can't you salt it? Because again, we'll say salting the chaylev also is somewhat comparable to the act of tanning. Remember, the only reason you're salting it is because you want to preserve it for use, whatever, either after Yom Tov or sometime later on. So you can't salt it on Yom Tov because it resembles the act of tanning. The other possibility also is that moving chaylev could be potentially aser. Why? Because the might say it could be an inyan of muktzah. But let's go with the tanning idea for now. Ve'ein mahapchin bahen. And furthermore, you can't turn the fats over. Can't turn the. So look at Rashi. Why would you be doing this? In molchinas esachalavim biyom tov kedish liyasricho vafilu nishchata behem biyom tov. So I will say you do want to do all of these things. Turn it over to allow for greater airflow. You can't go ahead and salt it. All of this is being done because you don't want the fats to spoil. But because again this resembles tanning, you can't do it on Yom Tov. In the name of Rabbi Yeshua, they said, "Shotchan beruach agabi yisedos." What can you do? You can place the fat down, literally, Rabbi say, yisedos are pegs. So you can go ahead and place the fat down in a way that there's airflow around it. So apparently having constant airflow prevents the fats from spoiling. Amar Rav Masna. Rav Masna says, halach Rabbi Yeshua. Rav Masna says, halach Rabbi Yeshua, that indeed you could put the fats down on top of pegs to allow for airflow. So Mar says, Ikeda Amri Rav Masna, in halach Rabbi Yeshua. Others say Rav Masna said, halacha does not follow Rabbi Yeshua. So I understand why the first opinion has to say that halacha follows Rabbi Yeshua. Why? It's trich saka da'itcha amina yochid v'rabim halacha kirabim. Because it will say, why would I need a statement that the halacha follows Rabbi Yeshua? Because Rabbi Yeshua argues on the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon say that you may not go ahead and you can't do anything with the fat on Yom Tov. Meaning Rabbi Yeshua says you could pick up the fat and place it on top of pegs to allow for airflow. The Tanakhama, the Rabbanon say you can't do that. So I understand why Rabbi Yeshua would have had to make a statement, why Rav Masna would have to make a statement that Allah calls Rabbi Yeshua. Why? Because it will say generally when you have a machlokes, and on one side you have the collective, on the other side you have the individual, who does the halacha follow? The halacha follows the collective. So Rav Masna comes along and says, no, in this case, the halacha follows the individual. Ella Mandamar, Pshita. But according to Mandamar, says the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yeshua. Why do you even have to say that? Yachid v'rabim halacha kirabim. On both sides, obviously halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Yeshua. Why? Because Rabbi Yeshua is the solitary standalone opinion, and the Rabbanon are the majority. So of course, Lamaisa, it does not. The halacha does not follow Rabbi Yeshua. Therefore, the Gemara says, "Tema mistaber taima Rabbi Yeshua dilo sharis lemimana v'lo shachit." Oh, I was saying, it's very interesting because I might have thought the logic of Rabbi Yeshua is very logical. Why? Because Rabbi say, if you do not allow the individual to do something to salvage the fat, what's going to happen? He may not shecht. Rabbi say, you have to have an appreciation for this. Animals are expensive. Livestock is expensive. So when you shechted an animal, what did you do? You lined up how pretty much every usable part of that animal was going to be maximized. Because otherwise, if you end up throwing out stuff, that's a financial loss for you. Financial. So we'll say. So therefore, what Rabbi Yeshua is saying is like this. So therefore, if you're the Jew, and now you wanna have some flesh, you wanna have some meat on Yom Tov. So what happens? You're gonna check your animal, but if you don't know that you could salvage the fats, because there could be significant fats, then what? You may not shecht on Yom Tov. Why? Because also you just say to yourself, you know what? I'd rather have milchiks. Nobody would rather have milchiks. But again, Lamaisef, at the end of the day, that's what you have to do. Because again, it's going to go ahead and I'm going to suffer a loss. So then I just won't shecht. So I might have thought that halacha follows, even though Rabbi Yeshua is the solitary opinion, I might have thought that we're still going to follow him. Why? Because we need to be lenient in these kind of situations. Otherwise, people just simply won't shecht animals on Yom Tov. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash on that even though that would have been the logic to say to follow Rabbi Yoshua, Kamash Malon, we still don't pass like Rabbi Yoshua because he is the Yachid and Yachid is Rabim Halachic Kirabim. Umay Shna. May other thing so now the Gemara opens this up, and the Gemara says, "You know what? Let's analyze this." Because remember again, what did Beis Hillel allow? Beis Hillel said that when you check the animal on Yom Tov, what can you do with the hide? You can place it down in an area of high pedestrian traffic, and in doing so, what will happen? The hide essentially you begin the process of tanning. Now, both say, why does Beis Shammai allow you to do that? So Rashi says, if you look at the last Rashi in the Shara Beis Hillel. The assumption is the logic of Beis Hillel is what? That if we don't allow you to do that, so we'll say if we don't allow you to put down the hide, then what happens to the hide by the end of Yom Tov? Pretty much it's wasted. So what's Beis Hillel's logic for allowing you to put down the hide in the area of high pedestrian traffic? Because if we don't allow it, then what? People won't shecht. People won't shecht because again, the loss of a hide, depending on the size of the animal, could be a significant financial loss. So Beis Hillel realizes that if we don't find, it's also very interesting because what you see over here is Beis Hillel reacting that halacha. People think that halacha is rigid and that the halacha does not react to the realities. It's not true. Halacha is a living, breathing, organic entity which is able to go ahead. I won't even say adapt, but is able to provide plans for all types of situations. Doesn't always give you the answer that you want. Doesn't mean halacha could always give you what you want, but the halacha recognizes the reality of circumstances. So here Beis Hillel says we have to allow you to put down the hide because at the end of the day, if we don't, people simply won't shecht. It'd be correct, and then ultimately it's a loss of Simchas Yom Tov. So the Gemara is questioning. You seem to say that we don't care about Rabbi Yeshua's statement about the fats, which seems to indicate that even with a loss, we're not worried about people not shechting. But yet, Beis Hillel clearly said that you could put down the hide in the area of high pedestrian traffic because Lemaisa, it seems we think that Beis Hillel's logic is that if we don't allow you to do this, you may go ahead and what? You may go ahead and come to not shecht, which would be diminution in your Simchas Yom Tov. To which the Gemara says, no, here's the difference. Hasam l'muchcha milsam. The boss said the act of spreading out the hide on the floor, and that people are going to trample on, even though what? Even though your intention is to begin the process of tanning the hide, your intention is not obviously understandable. Why? Mishum dechazi lemizga alei. Because Rabbi say lemaisa again, people spread out hides all of the time. Why? Because people spread it out as mats to sit on. Therefore, lemaisa again, your act of spreading out the hide on Yom Tov does not register as an act of tanning, but rather, what does it look like? It looks like an act of placing a mat for people to sit down. Because of that, lemaisa, that's why Beis Hillel allows you to do it on Yom Tov. Look at Rashi. Hasam lo muchacha milsa shetehei shtichaso litzorech ibud. Because the act of placing the hide on the ground does not immediately look like an act of tanning. Why? Demeimar Amar, because a person who sees this could easily say, "Hi, disharli rabbanon l'sitol adrisa." That the rabbis permitted me to place the hide, even though people are walking on top of it. Mitzorech yom tov etiru af shtichasot tzorech yom tov dechazi lemizga alei. So we'll say again, the reason why the hide case works is because when someone sees that, it doesn't register. They don't automatically assume that Reuven is trying to tan his hide, but rather, what do they assume? That Reuven is placing a mat because he has family over, people are there. Aval hacha kabe chalavim kisharis l'shotchan muchacha milsa shelatikuna chalavim hitiraso va'asinami lemim lechinhu umelicha me'avos melachosi b'davar sheyesh bo iba disnan. So we'll say, but here's the difference. In the case of the fats, there's only one reason you're putting that on pegs, which is what? which is what? To preserve it. Oh, if that's the case, then what would we be concerned about? If we allow you to do that, then you may come to do what? You may come to salt it. And Rabbi say salting, see, the act of putting on the pegs is not really a big deal. But we're concerned that because it's obvious that the reason you're putting on the pegs is in order to preserve it, once you're preserving it, you may come to salt it. And salting the fats could be an issue ultimately of ibud, of tanning on Yom Tov. So I will say, what comes out over here is that Beis Hillel gives you the license to engage in certain activities without which you may not shecht, as long as what? As long as those activities can be cloaked in normative Yom Tov behaviors. But so therefore, we'll allow you to put out the hide on the floor, even though in essence it's going to end up being, you're going to begin the process of tanning because people will be walking over it. Because when you look at that act, you don't see an act of tanning. You see people placing hides on the floor for others to sit on, which is a normative act. But the placement of the fats on the pegs is done for only one reason, and one reason only, which is to preserve the fats. Once that's being done, there's a chashash that what? One may come to salt it, which could be a real isser. So the Gemara says, but if we allow you to go ahead and place the fats on the pegs, people will say, oh, the reason this is permitted is because to preserve it. So who cares if I place it on the pegs or if I salt it? Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So Rav Yehuda's name is Shmuel. Moleach adam kama chatichos basar basachos. A person could salt multiple pieces of meat at once, even though what Rabbi is saying, even though Lamaisi you only need one piece of meat. Rabbi says it's a very important yesod. This has to do with the concept of riboy bashiurim, which is, and we'll see this more explicitly later on. The halacha is you're allowed to go ahead and do more. You're allowed to do certain acts for more than what you need for Yom Tiv if it requires no additional exertion. So what the Gemara is suggesting over here is, for example, I could salt multiple pieces of meat, even though I only need one. Why? Because the act is the same, right? The act of salt, that's salting, by the way. Okay, so right, the act of salting is the same. There's no additional tirchanis. Just to understand the practical ramification of this, I'm permitted to cook on Yom Tov. So I don't have to say, you know what, I have 5 people in my family, and you know what, this one eats 2 pieces of chicken, and this one eats 1 piece of chicken. Oh, so I could cook 6 pieces. It's not true. You could cook 25 pieces of chicken. Why? Because the act of cooking, as long as there's no additional tircha, you don't have to be specific in the amount of food you are preparing. Obviously, it has to be within reason, as we'll discuss, right? But again, Lamaisa, therefore, you could salt multiple pieces of meat because the act of exertion is the same, even though, again, you only need 1 piece. This is very interesting. Rav Adabar Ava Ma'arim Umalach Garma Garma. So we'll say apparently Rav Adabar Ava employed a different strategy, and what he would do is he would take a piece of meat and he would salt it, and then he'd say, you know what, I don't want that piece of meat. Let me look at the next one. He'd say, oh, this is the one I want. Then he would salt that one, and then what he'd say, you know what, I don't want that piece of meat. So he would employ this little bit of salt. Now why Rav Adabar Ava apparently Rav Adabar Ava felt that he has to do this. The Ma'aseh will say we pass, you don't have to do that because we pass like the first approach, which says that as long as there's no additional exertion involved, the Ma'aseh you could do even for much more than what you need. So it says the Mishnah. Beis Shammai says in misakinas atrisi b'yom tov. Rabbi say we made reference to this case in yesterday's daf as well. Beis Shammai says you may not remove. Rabbi say trisin are shutters. Trisin are shutters. You can't remove the shutters on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel says not only can you remove the shutters, but what? You can even go ahead and put them back after you finish. Rabbi says the Gemara, my trisin. What are we talking about over here? Amar Ula Trise Chanuyas. Rabbi say, so this is talking about the shutters of their vendor stalls. Rabbi say, now what does this mean? These stalls, you know, I guess the best way to explain it would be if you can imagine also like what you have like in the mall. You know, like in the mall you have like these not the stores, kiosks. I'm sorry? That's right, they're all manned by Jews. Right? So you're right, so if you want to buy Dead Sea products, so you know, right? So you go to the mall. Right, I'm sorry? Or what's helicopters? Oh, they sell helicopters. Okay, good. So whatever you want to buy is really irrelevant to what I want to talk about over here today. So whatever it is, the point is you have these kiosks. So if you can imagine the way Talmudic kiosks were set up was you had the vendor stall, and I will say what happens is at night when you wanted to close it up, you had these shutters. So the shutters also were kind of like the doors. And then what happened? You took off the shutters. We call them shutters. It's probably a better word for it, but we'll use the word shutters. You took it off, and those shutters then became the tables on which again the vendors would put their wares. So Beis Shammai says you may not remove the shutters from the structures on Yom Tov, and Beis Hillel says you can. So the Gemara says the following. Again, the issue over here would seem to be an issue ultimately again of binyan, an issue ultimately again of building. Now I will say, because again the act of taking the shutters off would seem to be tantamount to an act of demolition. The act of putting the shutters back on would be tantamount to an act of building. And I will say, I want to be clear over here, this is all the Rabbanon. Why is it the Rabbanon? Because I will say, interesting enough, that's why Rashi later on will qualify. He will explain these structures are not attached to the ground. Once something is not attached to the ground, we're not dealing with biblical building. Right? Biblical building is only with things attached to the ground. So therefore, again, we're dealing with the Rabbanons. So Beis Shammai still seems to feel that Lamaisa, again, this is an act of binyan, or an act of demolition, whereas Beis Shammai, for some reason, permits it. So the Gemara says, let's go on. Amr Ula said, Shlosha Dvarim Hitiru Sofan Mishum Tzchasam. What says a fascinating case? So Ula says, there are three things that Beis Hillel permitted you to do Hitira and Sofan. He permitted you to do them Mishum Tchilasan. Literally means he permitted the end because of the beginning, which is a way of saying we permitted you to do something down the road in order that you would not cease and desist from doing something in the beginning. Now what does that mean? It'll become clear once you illustrate the cases. These are the cases. Number one, or lifnei adarsan. Case one I will say is placing the hide in front of or by pedestrian traffic. So also we already covered that case. So now you can see what that lashon means. Hitir and sofan mishum tchilasan. We allow you to place the hide even in a place where people are going to walk, even though in essence what will happen, the tanning process will begin. That's called sofan. We allow that end act. Why? Mishum tchilasan. Because in order to encourage you to shech your animal on Yom Tov, because if we don't allow you to place the hide down, you won't shech the animal mitchila. Next, utrise chanuyos, the case of the shutters of the stores, which we'll discuss in just a moment, and v'chazaras r'tiyah b'mikdash, and Rabosai, and the case of returning the bandage to a wound in the Beis HaMikdash. Rabosai, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, chazaras r'tiyah b'mikdash, r'tiyah b'shabes paraklal gadol, amru hamimareach r'tiyah b'shabes chay mishum machik. Rabosai, we know again there are two issues over here. First of all, you're not permitted to engage in medicinal healing on Shabbos. You're not permitted to engage in medicinal healing on Shabbos. The reason for that is because Gzeira of Schika Salman, I'm concerned that one may come to grind up herbs to create medicines on Shabbos. So the Rebbe say, and further, based on that, you would not be permitted to go ahead and take a bandage and put it on a wound on Shabbos. Now, this is for a different reason also, because the bandage has what? The bandage has ointment on it, and the act of taking an ointment or a salve and smearing it on you is an issue of memachik, is an issue of smoothing, which is one of the lametes malachos on Shabbos. So we'll see what this case is in just a moment. V'rachba amar Rabbi Yehuda, Rachba said Rabbi Yehuda, even what? Actually, let me show you this case. Let me just look at Rashi B'Mikdash. Rashi says, "L'kohen shalach habiyado." What's this case? This is the man, a kohen who has a wound on his hand. V'tzarech la'avoda avoda v'litor etime al yado shalote chatzitza ben yado la'avoda machzir haratir la'achar avoda de'ilo sharis la'achzira lo shakili mikar. So we'll say this case over here is the following: Kohen has a wound on his hand, and what? Now the halacha is, when a kohen does an avoda, there can be no chatzitza. He can't have anything on his hands or on his feet. So what happens? If a kohen has a wound on his hand, he has a bandage, he has to take off that bandage prior to doing the avoda. But then what's going to happen? After the avoda, what does he want to do? He wants to place it back. What's the problem? It's Shabbos. He can't place it back. He can't place it back for two reasons. Number one, because again, we don't allow people to engage in medicinal healing on Shabbos, because out of a fear that one may come to grind. And number two, placing the bandage back with the ointment would be what? Would be an act of shmearing memachik. But yet, what we realize that if what happens if we don't go ahead and permit him to place the bandage back, then what may happen? So one of two things. So we'll say, there's really only one of one things. We're not really choshish that he's going to do the avoda with the bandage on, because Kohanim take their avoda responsibilities very seriously, and he's not going to do the avoda in an illegal way. Instead, what will happen? He just won't do it. he just won't do it. And therefore, again, to avoid the Kohen not doing the avoda, we allow him to put the bandage back on after his avoda. So the Gemara says, "V'rachba, Am Rabbi Yehuda, Rachba saying Rabbi Yehuda, Af haposeach chaviso umaschil beisaso al gav haregel al gav haregel." And I will say, so Rachba adds another case. Rachba says, name Rabbi Yehuda, even the case of a chaver. I will say this is a case of a person who is makbid with ritual purity and impurity, who opens up his barrel on Yom Tov and begins to sell his wares, that he can go ahead and continue to sell it after Yom Tov in a state of ritual purity. Va'ali Rabbi Yehuda, in accordance to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And I will say, now, what is this talking about over here? This is a very interesting case. This is a very interesting case. The halacha is like this. Under normal circumstances, an Amma Oretz is considered to be Tameh. Amar is considered to be Tamei, rabbinic Tumah, except on the regel. On Yom Tov, there's an understanding that the Chazal said, remember, and that's rabbinic Tumah. On the regel, on the regel, so Chazal said that even a Amma Oretz is considered to be ritually pure. So we'll say now, because if you don't do that, you're gonna have a big problem. What's gonna happen? Let's say I'm selling my food to the Oli Regel. And what's Kepen Rabosai? So now, what occurs, you ever see people in the fruits and vegetable aisle, at the supermarket? So what happens, right? Mamish, they're shaking, they're touching, they're they have their hands all over everything. So the truth is, that's the way people are when it comes. So what happens? If you say that the Amma Oretz has Tuma during the regel, it's going to pose a major problem, because what's going to happen? Then all food is going to become Tameh. So therefore what? During the regel, we say that even an Amma Oretz is in a state of ritual purity, and therefore if he touches food, it's not going to be a problem. But what happens to, let's say, somebody started selling food during the regel, and now it's after the regel? What's the status of that? So now we know that food was touched by an Amma Oretz over the course of the regel. What happens again after Yom Tov? What's the status of that food after Yom Tov? So if we look at Rashi says, take a look at the last short line in Rashi. So the Chachamim say, Lo yigmar v'lo yimkarenu od, mishum nitmes beregel b'maga Amma Oretz. Unihi dechol yemos haregel ishtaroi shelo levaisham, mihula achar regel chal lemafreya, v'ashmu'in rachba, to Rabbi Yehuda lo Amar Yigmar Ela Mishum Tchilasan Deliilo Sharis Leila Pasach Lemikar. So also listen to this. So the Chachamim say that after Yom Tov, whatever leftover food you have, whatever leftover food vendor you have after Yom Tov is what? Is Tameh. It's Tameh. Why? Because we know that it was touched by an Amma Oretz, and even though on Yom Tov again we suspend the laws of Tumah as they apply to an Amma Oretz, after Yom Tov, the Mafreya we know it was touched, and therefore after Yom Tov the leftovers are Tameh. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's not Tameh. Why? Because if you go ahead and you put a Tumah status on the leftover, then what's going to happen? Vendors will be very hesitant to put out food. Essentially, food will be in short supply. Why? Because no one wants to suffer a loss. So instead, what vendors will do is they'll only put out very little at a time in order to ensure that there's no leftovers past Yom Tov. So therefore, again, Rachba, as in this last case, of the food of the vendors. Let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, "Avali Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar Yigmar." So now the Gemara goes through each of these cases. Or Lifnei Adars. And case number one was that Beis Hillel permitted us to put the hide even in front of pedestrian traffic. Tanina. Okay, we already learned this case. Mao de Tema. I might have thought that Beis Hillel's logic, the reason why Beis Hillel allows you to put down the hide is why Rabosai? Because again, the hide is usable to sit on. So maybe Beis Hillel's logic is, since the hide is usable to sit on, therefore the Mai said that's why you can go ahead and place it down on Yom Tov, and that would apply what Rabosai to even a hide that from an animal that was shechted on Erev Yom Tov. That Beis Hillel just now allows you to place the hide down. It says, "Kamash Malon hitiru sofan mishum tchilasan." Therefore, again, the Gemara over here teaches us that no, the reason Beis Hillel allows you to place down the hide is why Rabosai, because if we don't allow you to place the hide down and allow it to be walked on by people, what's going to happen? People will simply not shecht, and therefore the Yom Tov in, the Erev Yom Tov lo. This allowance only applies to what Rabosai, an animal that is shechted on Yom Tov, but not to an animal that is shechted on Erev Yom Tov. Next case, Shrisei Chanios Nami Tanina, Ubeisila Mutat Matir and Aflachsir. The case of the shutters of the vendor's stall, we also learned in the Mishnah Mao de tema tamau de beisila mishum de in binyan bekelim bein stidra bekelim vafilu debatim. I might have thought that the logic over here of Beisil, because Beisil Rabbi said that's what? That there is no issue of building when it comes to utensils. There's no malacha of bone when it comes to utensils. There's no malacha of demolition when it comes to utensils. And even for what? Even for utensils inside the home. Inside the home. Therefore, again, kamash malon, no, that's not Beisil's logic. Hitiru sof on mishum tchilasan. That Rabbi say, why does Beisil allow you to go ahead and remove the shutters and even put back the shutters? Because the say again, sof on mishum tchilas. Because Rabbi say, if we don't allow you to do this, so what's going to happen? There's not going to be enough supplies for the people on Yom Tov, and therefore we permit this practice. Next, we already learned. So again, case number 3 was that the Kohen after the avodah is permitted to go ahead and put the bandage back on his hand. We learned that already. Medina. We already learned that the Kohen after his avodah is permitted to go ahead and put the bandage back on his wound after he does the avodah. That is true, Rabbi where? In the Mikdash, but not in the Medina. Rabbi say, what's Medina? Medina is anywhere outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So what might you have thought? Taimamai, Mishum Dein Shavus B'Mikdash. Because I might have thought the reason why that is permitted is why? Because Rabbi say, Shvusin, which means Dinei D'Rabbanan, do not apply in the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi say, remember again, the prohibition on medicinal healing is a D'Rabbanan. So I might have thought that what? That only that shvusin do not apply in the Beis HaMikdash. That's why it's permitted. But I both say again, who does this dispensation apply to? Afilu kohen delav baravodahu. And I might have thought that because again D'Rabbanans don't apply in the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, what Rabbi say, this license to take a bandage on and off applies even to who? Even to any kohen. Right? Even not necessarily to just the kohen who's doing the avodah. Therefore, kamash malan hitiru sofan mishum tchilasan. Therefore, the Gemara explicitly tells me that no. This dispensation is why we only allow you to put it back on, lest what? Lest you not come to do the avodah to begin with, and therefore the bar avodah in, the lav bar avodah lo. The dispensation only applies to a kohen who is going to do the avodah, but not to stam a kohen who is not going to be doing the avodah. Poseach es chaviso nami tanina. So I will say the case of the opening of the barrel. To say that the Pasek Rabbi Yehuda, that even afterwards the leftovers are going to be still tahor. We also learned it that a merchant who begins to sell his food during Yom Tov, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yigmar. Rabbi Yehuda says that he could sell off the leftovers even after Yom Tov and assume that the leftovers are tahor. And the Chum say you may not finish it. Also, when the Chum say you may not finish it, you could finish it, but just what? It's tamei. It's tamei. What would you have thought? Tumas ama aretz beregel kitara shavi rabbanon. You might have thought the following, that the tuma of an ama aretz on Yom Tov. So the rabbis say, you know what? We suspend it. It's just like his tahar. Va'af delo hischil nami. And even though what? They say, let's say again, I have food that I did not begin on Yom Tov, but I sold Yom Tov. I mean, let's say I'm a vendor. I started selling food before Yom Tov. Before Yom Tov already. So I might have thought that again, Lamaisa, after Yom Tov, that should be permitted as well. Because again, at the end of the day, there's no tumah for an Amma Aretz on Yom Tov itself. Kamash Malon Hitiru Sofan Mishum Tchilasan. Therefore, you see from here that we only permitted the end because of the beginning, meaning his schil in, lo his schil in. To Rabbi Yehuda's leniency is only regarding what? Food items that were started, that the vendor started to sell on Yom Tov itself. So if he started to sell something on Yom Tov, then what? Then Rabbi Yehuda says you could sell it after Yom Tov, still in a state of ritual purity, because we're concerned that if we don't extend that Yom Tov status to post Yom Tov, then what? Vendors will be reticent to take out additional food. But lemaisa, his schil in, lo his schil. But I both say, if I'm a vendor and I started selling food, let's say a week before Yom Tov, and I sold it through Yom Tov, and there's leftovers now post Yom Tov, Rabbi Yehuda's dispensation does not apply. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda's dispensation only applies when? For food that was begun on Yom Tov itself. But food begun before Yom Tov would, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, would still be tamei after Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, let's just read one more line. V'ula mai taima lo amar. Why does Ula not include this fourth case of the food that was started on Yom Tov? beplukta lo kamairi, because Ula does not want to get involved in cases of machlokes. And since this case of the vendor is a machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon, Ula didn't want to get into it. So what are you talking about? Hanach nami pluktaninu. I will say, but the first three cases are also machlokes in between. The other cases are also machlokes in between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, to which Ula will answer Beis Shammai b'makom Beis Hillel eino mishnah. Those are fighting words, I will say, because the Gemara says, because when Beis Shammai machlokes, when Beis Shammai disagrees with Beis Hillel, that's not even a machlokes, right? That's tough stuff, right? So when Beis Shammai, it's so clear we passing like Beis Hillel that we don't even consider that to be like a machlokes. So I will say, we'll stop over here. The minute should pick up here tomorrow. Again, tomorrow will be okay. Amud Beis is long, but I'm an hour a little bit shorter. We'll start again 5:45.